Imagine yourself, if you will, in a room lit not by bright lamps or electric bulbs, but by flickering oil flames that dance lazily against walls painted with gods and goddesses. The air is heavy with the scent of resin and incense, a perfume meant to calm the spirit, but one that, in its thickness, can feel almost suffocating. Outside, beyond the sandstone walls, the night winds brush against the Nile, carrying with them the smell of water and silt and the faint rustle of reeds. Somewhere in the distance, musicians may still be playing faint notes to mark the great occasion. And yet here you are, seated on a carved bed, not filled with joy, but with a slow, creeping sense of dread. The man beside you is not someone you chose, not someone who wooed you, not someone whose laugh ever stirred affection in your heart. He is your brother. And though every instinct within you whispers that this union is wrong, the laws of your kingdom, the whispers of the priests, and the unyielding traditions of your people insist that what is about to happen is not just permitted, but commanded by the gods themselves. This was the strange, almost unthinkable reality for Egyptian queens across more than 3,000 years of dynastic rule. Behind the masks of gold and the shining statues we see in museums today, behind the Hollywood tales of passionate romance and seductive Cleopatra, lay something colder, more systematic, and infinitely more tragic. A marriage system that turned intimacy into a duty, a sacred duty, yes, but one that stripped women of choice, comfort, and sometimes even their sense of self. When we think of ancient Egypt, it is easy to be distracted by pyramids that pierce the sky, temples that gleam in sunlight, and monuments so vast they seem carved by giants rather than men. But behind these wonders were lives lived in quiet rooms, lives hemmed in by tradition and ruled by an iron web of family expectations. The queens of Egypt, daughters, sisters, nieces, were the lifeblood of dynasties, not because they were loved, but because they were useful. Marriage among the Pharaohs was not a gentle story of two souls meeting. It was a carefully orchestrated arrangement, a calculated design meant to keep bloodlines pure and power contained within the royal family. In our modern world, marriage is often seen as a matter of affection, of compatibility, sometimes even of personal happiness. In the palaces along the Nile, it was closer to a ledger entry, a transaction, a movement on a grand chessboard where women were pieces arranged to ensure that no outsider could ever dilute the sacred line of kingship. The queens knew this. From their earliest days, they were taught not to imagine futures of their own making. Little girls born into royal households grew up surrounded not by playmates of their choosing, but by the whispers of what roles they might fill when they reached maturity. They were told stories of Isis and Osiris, the divine pair of brother and sister whose sacred union justified the practices of mortal rulers. They were reminded over and over again that their bodies were not their own, that their nights were not their own, that their children, when they came, would belong to the throne, not to them. And so, on their wedding nights, what might have been joy for others became an act of submission. It was not the anticipation of love, but the awareness of duty that filled the room. Imagine the silence that must have settled in those chambers, the silence of expectation, the silence of fear, the silence of women who knew resistance was not only futile, but blasphemous. Egyptians recorded everything with the careful neatness of a people who believed the written word had power. They left us marriage contracts etched in ink, contracts that speak in dry, legal tones about arrangements that, when lived, must have felt unbearably intimate. These contracts tell us of unions not simply between husband and wife, but between uncle and niece, father and daughter, brother and sister. They tell us of how many children were expected, of what would happen if a wife failed to provide those children, of what punishments might await if obligations were not met. They are chilling in their detachment, and yet, for the officials who wrote them, they were simply another form of administration. Even the feasts that celebrated these marriages carried an undercurrent of sorrow. Imagine the banquet halls filled with food, roasted goose, honey cakes, jars of beer, sweet dates piled high in baskets. Musicians played lyres and flutes, dancers twirled, servants poured wine. Guests laughed, toasted the union, and spoke of prosperity for the dynasty. And yet, somewhere in the corner of that very hall sat the bride, smiling as she was expected to smile, while knowing that once the music ended, once the torches dimmed, she would be led away into a chamber where her fate was already sealed. The priests, too, played their role. They reminded the people that the Pharaoh was a god and that his blood was divine. To mix that blood with anyone less than royal was to pollute the divine order. Thus, the sisters and daughters were not simply brides. They were vessels, guardians of godhood itself. Their suffering was not suffering, the priest said. It was service. Their dread was not dread. It was devotion. Their silence was not silence. It was sacred obedience. And what could one do when every story carved on temple walls, every hymn sung in the sanctuaries, every ritual enacted before the gods repeated the same message? This is holy. This is necessary. This is right. Resistance became unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it was painted as rebellion against the cosmos. The palace walls themselves became prisons. Royal women lived in harem quarters, not as free wives, but as competitors, rivals in a contest to produce heirs. They were watched, measured, recorded. Their movements were not their own. They were kept apart from men who were not kin, isolated to ensure that their loyalties never strayed, and surrounded by attendants who were often spies as much as companions. There was no space for trust in such halls. Women turned against women, friendships soured into rivalries, whispers of affection became weapons. The palace cultivated this mistrust, feeding it deliberately, because a woman too secure in her bonds might become bold enough to resist. Better to keep them anxious, desperate, eager to prove their worth by pleasing the dynasty in any way demanded. And so the wedding night, far from being a beginning of love, was the beginning of a cycle of pregnancies, some successful, some ending in sorrow. A cycle of expectations, met or unmet, each one carrying consequences. A cycle of being weighed, judged, and often found wanting. Outside the palace, life went on. Farmers tended the Nile's floods. Craftsmen carved stone for temples. Merchants haggled in markets. To them, the affairs of the palace were distant, perhaps even divine. They might have looked up to their queens as figures of power, unaware of the chains those women bore behind closed doors. But within those gilded chambers, the truth was different. The truth was quieter, sadder, and unbearably human. As one Egyptian queen after another discovered, the golden mask could shine brilliantly under the sun, but it was always heavy to wear. The monuments of Egypt may still rise against the sky, but they are built in part upon the muted voices of women whose stories rarely reach us. And so, as the wedding night approached, the queen-to-be found herself less a bride and more a sacrifice to a larger plan. Less a bride and more a sacrifice to a larger plan. That is how the night unfolded, again and again, for generations of women who wore the title of queen in Egypt. The word queen itself might suggest to us today an image of glittering crowns, of power and freedom, of a woman standing proudly beside her king. But in the silent hours of that first night, when the guests had gone and the lamps had dimmed, that title became something altogether different. It became a burden, a chain, a weight that pressed heavily upon a young woman's heart. The purpose of marriage in ancient Egypt, especially among royalty, was not happiness, it was continuity. It was about the line, the blood, the dynasty. The Pharaoh was thought to be divine, the son of gods, and therefore his children needed to carry the same sacred spark. But how does one protect divinity? The answer the Egyptians gave was chillingly simple: by folding the family inward upon itself. And so the queen did not marry for love or even for preference. She married because the priests said she must, because the scribes had recorded her as suitable, because her birth made her both precious and trapped. The wedding night was not the opening of a partnership, it was the testing ground of duty. Could she bear children? Could she endure? Could she give the dynasty what it demanded? In the chambers of the palace, rituals surrounded this duty. Some were elaborate, with hymns sung to Isis and Osiris, their divine union held up as the model for mortals. Others were quieter, subtler, yet no less heavy in meaning. Perfumed oils were rubbed into the queen's skin, not for pleasure, but for purification. Linen sheets embroidered with protective symbols were laid upon the marriage bed, as if magic might ease what fear could not. Priests whispered blessings at the threshold, reminding bride and groom that their union was not theirs at all, but the gods'. The queen, in those moments, was expected to transform. She was no longer daughter, no longer sister, no longer herself. She became a vessel, a container for bloodline and divinity. And what greater isolation could there be than to step into such a role, stripped of choice, stripped of ordinary tenderness? We must pause here and imagine, not with excitement but with the slowness of sympathy, what it felt like for those women. Imagine the silence of the chamber, the coldness of stone beneath painted plaster, the flickering shadows on the walls. Imagine knowing that refusal was not only dangerous but impossible, for to resist was to defy not merely a husband, but a god. The body became a battlefield where duty conquered desire, where fear swallowed hope. These were not isolated arrangements. They were repeated with clock-like precision. Every few generations, dynasties practiced what they called divine marriages, brothers to sisters, fathers to daughters, uncles to nieces. And because they were planned so meticulously, they became ordinary within palace life, even though, to us, they seem extraordinary. Palace officials studied children as they grew, recording who might one day be paired with whom. The process was less about affection and more about mathematics. Which unions would secure the line, which would preserve the sacred blood? Girls especially bore the weight of this system. From childhood, they were prepared, not for free lives, but for roles that already awaited them. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to manage ceremonies. They learned to sing hymns, to pour libations, to play the part of goddess. In rituals. And behind these skills was the unspoken truth. All of this was to prepare them to serve in the palace marriage system. Isolation was a key part of this preparation. The most promising daughters were kept apart, guarded, monitored. Their friends were other royal women who themselves lived under the same shadow of expectation. Bonds between them were shallow, for each one knew that in time competition would arise. A woman who bore the heir would be elevated. A woman who did not might be forgotten. On the wedding night itself, the weight of religion pressed down heavily. Priests reminded the queen that her sacrifice was holy. They told her that her suffering was sacred, that it connected her to the gods. They told her that to resist was not simply to defy her husband, but to defy heaven itself. And so, under such words, resistance became impossible. The palace bureaucracy, too, added to the burden. Marriage contracts spelled out duties as if love could be measured in ink. They noted how many children must be born, what would happen if they were deformed, what punishment awaited if the queen failed in her role. Some papyri even detailed schedules, listing when a wife would be available to her husband, as if intimacy were no more than a resource to be managed. We might think of harems as places of luxury, filled with silks and music and gentle indulgence. But the records tell another story. They tell of women living under surveillance, of rivalries that turned bitter, of whispered betrayals. Queens and princesses competed for the pharaoh's attention, for the chance to secure their own children's futures. Friendships crumbled into suspicion. Trust was rare. The palace encouraged this atmosphere deliberately because divided women were easier to control. And through it all, the wedding night was remembered not as a night of joy, but as the doorway into this endless cycle of expectation and fear. A young woman entered as a bride, but she emerged as a tool of the dynasty. Meanwhile, the empire itself benefited. These marriages were not just about blood. They were about wealth and power. Dowries included land, gold, servants, sometimes even entire villages. Marriages sealed political alliances, cemented trade agreements, and ensured that loyalty remained within the family. The economy of Egypt was tied, thread by thread, to the wombs of its queens. Foreign kingdoms looked on with a mixture of awe and calculation. Some admired Egypt's system, seeing it as sophisticated, a method of controlling succession without the chaos of rival claimants. Others copied it, weaving Egyptian practices into their own dynasties. But few ever questioned it, for Egypt's power was vast, and its influence stretched across the Mediterranean. To criticize would have been to risk losing trade, or worse, to provoke Egypt's armies. And so, the system endured. It endured for centuries, shaping generation after generation of women. Each new queen stepped into the same cycle. Each new bride entered the same chamber of dread. Some may have accepted it as duty, some may have suffered silently, some perhaps even persuaded themselves it was divine. But beneath it all lay the same truth, that these women were less free than they appeared, less exalted than their title suggested. The golden mask of a queen gleamed brightly in public processions, but in private, the reality was darker. The wedding night marked the beginning of a long captivity, gilded but unyielding, where every breath was measured against duty, and every choice had already been made by others. And in the quiet after the feast, when the music had faded and the torches burned low, the queen was led into a chamber that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded prison. A gilded prison. That is what the wedding chamber became for so many Egyptian queens. Gilded because the walls shimmered with paintings of gods, because the lamps glowed upon polished stone, because incense curled like golden smoke through the air. But a prison nonetheless, because within those walls there was no escape, no freedom, no choice. The queen lay upon linens woven by the most skilled hands of the age, surrounded by symbols of prosperity and power, yet what she felt was not abundance, but confinement. The irony is striking. Egypt revered its goddesses, Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet, beings of immense power, embodiments of love, fertility, and divine might. Temples rang with hymns to their glory. Offerings of flowers, bread, and incense filled their altars. And yet, the mortal women who were said to embody those same qualities lived lives of quiet submission. The contradiction was never resolved because it was convenient not to resolve it. The myths gave justification, and the reality remained hidden in the silence of stone corridors. The queens were not simply wives, they were symbols. They represented the unbroken line of the divine, and that meant they were never truly individuals. A queen could not love where she wished. She could not choose her fate. She could not even mother her children freely, for those children were considered the property of the throne. When they grew, they were taken, trained, prepared to continue the cycle. Even the bond between mother and child was weakened by the needs of dynasty. We must imagine the loneliness. Picture a woman adorned in jewels, seated in a courtyard garden where lotus blossoms floated on still pools. Servants linger nearby, silent, always watching. The queen gazes at the water, sees her own reflection in the ripples, but knows she cannot speak her heart aloud. The air is warm, the birds call from the reeds, yet the weight inside her is heavier than stone. To the outside world she is powerful, within she is caged. And the wedding night was only the beginning. That night set in motion a life measured by expectations. Could she conceive quickly? Would her children be healthy? Would she please the gods through her submission? Would her obedience secure her place in the hierarchy of wives, or would she be cast aside, forgotten in some corner of the harem? Psychological pressure was constant. Resistance was framed as sacrilege. If she faltered, priests were ready with rituals to remind her that her suffering was not hers to question, but hers to sanctify. They told her stories of cosmic order, of Ma'at, the balance of the universe, insisting that her sacrifice kept the world itself from unraveling. To refuse was to bring disorder, not just to her household, but to the heavens. What an unbearable burden for one young woman to carry, the weight of both dynasty and cosmos upon her shoulders. And yet, daily life still moved on. Each morning the palace stirred with activity. Servants hurried through corridors carrying bread and beer, scribes hunched over papyrus recording accounts, officials debated in shaded halls. The queen, too, had her routines. She performed rituals, wore the crowns of Hathor in ceremonies, offered prayers to the gods. Outwardly, she lived in majesty, but inwardly, the chamber of the wedding night never left her. It followed her into every day, reminding her of how little control she truly had. The palace environment sharpened this sense of captivity. Women were encouraged to watch one another, to whisper reports, to compete for favor. A tender friendship might form, but suspicion always hovered. If one queen bore a son, another's status fell. If one wife displeased the pharaoh, others quietly stepped forward to take her place. And so, the natural bond of sisterhood was transformed into rivalry. Isolation was not an accident. It was a policy. What strikes modern historians most is how systematic this all was. Nothing was left to chance. Genealogies were drawn with precision, ensuring that marriages were planned generations in advance. Records of pregnancies were kept like inventories, noting successes and failures as if women were livestock. Even rituals of intimacy were scheduled, managed, logged. It was an empire of stone and river, yes, but also an empire of control, in which the most private corners of human life became state property. The children born of these unions, too, inherited the burden. Sons were taught that women were vessels of dynasty. Daughters were prepared for their own future wedding nights, their own gilded prisons. And so the cycle continued. The tragedy is not only that it happened once, but that it was repeated again and again across centuries. Foreign observers sometimes noticed. They saw the palaces, the rituals, the submissive queens. But instead of condemning, many admired. They mistook efficiency for greatness, control for sophistication, and in doing so, they allowed the system to continue unquestioned. The queen herself had no such luxury of detachment. Each night she returned to her chamber, each day she performed her duties. Each year she watched children born and taken, and all the while the same weight pressed upon her. Perhaps she found small comforts, a favorite garden, a moment of song, a fleeting smile from her child, but always the larger truth loomed. She was not free, and never would be. And yet, through the suffering, Egypt endured. Dynasties rose and fell, monuments were built, knowledge was advanced. But at what cost? The cost was carried by women whose names are forgotten, whose voices are silent, whose faces stare at us from tomb paintings, but whose inner lives remain shadows. When we look at the pyramids, we see marvels of engineering. When we walk through temples, we see the brilliance of artistry. But hidden behind them lies the unspoken truth, that these wonders were built not only by stonecutters and scribes, but by the quiet submission of queens whose wedding nights were prisons. And so the story circles back to us, the listeners drifting into slumber as these ancient tales unwind. It is not only a story of Egypt, but a reminder of how power can twist intimacy, how duty can crush joy, how entire civilizations can rise while muffling the voices of half their people. The queens of Egypt may never speak for themselves, but their silence speaks still. It lingers in the papyri, in the painted walls, in the faint traces of lives lived in shadows. It whispers to us across time, asking us to remember, to bear witness, to understand. And perhaps as you drift into sleep tonight, you may wonder whether history's silence carries the sighs of queens who never chose their nights at all.